Our beliefs are heavily influenced by the information and experiences we absorb during our childhood. A lot of these beliefs go on to form our worldviews and assumptions, and how we perceive and interact with the world. From time to time, we need to test the truth and durability of our beliefs. To do so, we must become comfortable receiving new or even outside information. Whether or not our current beliefs hold up, we will emerge stronger from these experiences with a more refined truth. However, encountering information that challenges these preconceived notions can be triggering. It can bring about a sort of intellectual fight or flight response. You may see this sometimes in interfaith discussions, especially when engaging with insights from the Jewish tradition that challenge one's understanding of the New Testament. At some point, it's common for someone to ask, where in the Bible does it say that? Right? This is often a grounding question to try to get back to some sense of stability when we realize there's a different side of the story in something we thought was pretty simple and straightforward. This question actually reveals one of the core beliefs, one influenced by the 16th century tradition known as Sola Scriptura. Where did Sola Scriptura originate? Sola Scriptura is a Latin phrase which means scripture alone. In its original context, this idea was framed within a religious and political and even social shift that sought to place the authority of Scripture above the traditions of the papacy. This idea had already emerged in the 13th century, but it would not pick up steam until the Protestant Reformation in the mid to late 1500s. A long history made short, by the early 16th century, there was a growing frustration with the Catholic Church's man-made traditions and the interpretive authority of the Pope. In 1517, a German Catholic monk by the name of Martin Luther formally sought to debate these issues, especially those he observed and documented in his 95 Theses. Though not his initial intention, this would open a rift that would profoundly change his life and the world, birthing a new movement we now call the Protestant Reformation. The thrust of Luther's challenge seemed to focus on the Pope's interpretive authority and the subsequent contradictions and traditions. One example was the selling of indulgences, which, for a fee, allowed one to reduce the amount of time they or a loved one might spend in purgatory. Luther reasoned that human interpretations, even those made by the Church, are ultimately inferior to the evidence of Scripture. He wrote, "Unless I be convinced by evidence of Scripture or by plain reason, I do not accept the authority of the Pope or the councils alone." He added that the notion of the Spirit would guide a person to the proper outcome. In short, man-made traditions would take a back seat to the guidance of the Spirit and the Bible. Now, this really sounds great to some, but this paved the way for significant problems down the road. We'll look at a few of them now. Number 1, guided by the Spirit. Immediately, we recognize the difficulty discerning between a Spirit-led interpretation and a really persuasive opinion. When one claims, "the Spirit told me," how could another verify the veracity of such a claim? Impossible to govern, this component would give way to a more academic approach, the institution of seminaries to ensure structured learning and adherence to doctrine. As Orthodox author James Kugel writes, "Many believed that control ought to be the doctoral degree, conferred by a proper school of divinity and not by spirit alone, study and pains and not merely by fasting and prayer." So we see this marked a shift in Protestantism that subordinated spiritual criteria for degrees and academic honors. As is usually the case where a passed-down tradition is absent, new traditions will develop in its place. In time, new denominations would establish seminaries of their own, churches, and the publications of new Bible translations, each that reflect their own particular interpretive conclusions. Perhaps an unforeseen outcome, Sola Scriptura would thus contribute to denominational boundaries that restrict people from studying outside their localized traditions. The second problem is no centralized authority. Years ago, I recall a conversation between two friends, one Catholic and the other a Protestant pastor. Both were on staff in their respective churches at the time. My Catholic friend could not understand how a church, the Protestant church, could function without a clear structure of upward accountability. My Protestant friend couldn't understand how to reconcile hierarchical structure with his democratized interpretation of the Bible. While some branches of Protestantism have reintroduced some degree of structure, others maintain order on a local level. However, without structure, the continual degradation of values continues to plague the denominations that lack these structures. Nevertheless, Catholicism has remained remarkably free of denominational splintering. The Protestant Church, however, has fractured into the tens of thousands. It's plausible to suggest that tradition might serve some utility in preventing disunity. The third problem is a bias against traditions, and especially Jewish tradition. It seems to me that Sola Scriptura has fueled a bias against tradition in some branches, a sentiment not shared by Eastern and Orthodox forms of Christianity, and definitely not Judaism for that matter. This may be partly attributed to how Luther built his argument. By oversimplifying and decontextualizing the interactions between Jesus and specific Pharisees, Luther cast himself and his opponents into the narrative, establishing a negative outlook regarding the traditions of men. Luther lacked the knowledge and nuanced understanding of these technical, intra-Jewish discussions of halakha, Jewish law, ironically demonstrating one of the most fatal flaws of Sola Scriptura. Considered outside the fences of Sola Scriptura, Jewish tradition has been unable to speak for itself regarding its theological outlook and parallels in the New Testament. As a result, much of the world's perceptions of the Jewish people have been derived from polemical distortions of the Gospels and the letters of Paul. It should be noted here, in 1962, Pope John XXIII acknowledged the Catholic Church's contribution to this error and sought to make corrections in its opening to Vatican II. However, given Martin Luther's anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish bias, Protestantism was born with a general disdain for Jewish tradition. To this day, Sola Scriptura maintains a strategic barrier that prevents readers from exploring Jesus' native worldview, metaphors, religious and cultural customs, none of which can be properly ascertained through a simple reading of the text. This is the reason someone can read their Bible all of their life and still be completely uninformed on the context and the meaning and the hidden meanings of passages in the New Testament. The Jewish approach to interacting with Scripture is vastly different from Sola Scriptura. All Jewish thought and writing revolves around the 5 books of Moses, known as the Torah, and sometimes referred to as Mikra. What many would consider the Jewish canon, or the Hebrew Bible, is referred to as the Tanakh, an acronym for Torah, the first 5 books we just mentioned, Nevi'im, the prophets, and the Ketuvim, the writings, which is the wisdom literature. With Torah as the nucleus, all midrash, mysticism, commentaries, chumash, targums, legal writings, Mishnah, Talmud, and the virtually endless ocean of literature that seeks to unpack and explore these depths, they can all be considered Torah. This is achieved through the framework of the Jewish hermeneutic system known as Pardes, which is something we speak about quite often on this site, The Hidden Orchard. This has been the way for thousands of years, with each generation adding new insights and revelations. Given this connectivity, again, all of this can be considered Torah. The key to understanding is this. Despite its widespread influence, Sola Scriptura impairs understanding of the context and the milieu of the Bible in general, and the New Testament in particular. Understanding requires new information, outside information. Incorporating the Jewish tradition will help bridge knowledge gaps of language, geography, history, social context, customs, metaphors, and even language. In doing so, we uncover new insights and find new meaning to old familiar passages that continue to challenge us to this day. That's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed this topic. Remember, you can find more information at thehiddenorchard.com. If you liked what you heard, please leave a review and share this podcast with your friends. We don't really engage in marketing, so it's word of mouth and references like that really help spread the word. Also, I want to say thank you to those who subscribe to the site and those who support the Hidden Orchard project financially. Without you, it wouldn't be possible, so thank you. Thanks to everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.